Okay, we are recording. So this will be a little discussion about doing good apologetics versus doing something else. Before we get started, Father, let the conversation please you and let it encourage us in our various ministries. In Jesus' name. Okay. Well, let me get a feel for you here. Do you engage in apologetics discussions with people? Or have to maybe defend the faith in some basic way, like someone asks you a hard question, do Christians believe this? Or why do Christians hate homosexuals? You know, some odd question where you're giving a defense of some sort, even if you're not engaged in one of these full-time apologetics works. And you certainly see these things on TV all the time. And in your mind, you may have an answer for it. And you may not. Some of the questions are hard questions. And some are superficial questions, but they play good to the public on TV. So what I want to go through today is some principles for doing your best apologetics, whatever that means. Okay. Now, in apologetics, there are 5 different ways to approach the subject matter. The really popular thing today is the question of evidence. Back in the 70s, Josh McDowell came out with the book Evidence That Demands a Verdict. He takes an evidential approach to apologetics. If you've seen the recent movie, The Case for Christ, Lee Strobel takes an evidence-based approach. He researched, he talked to the scholars, many of them skeptics, but got the answers to his questions. And he was able to, getting the answers, in his case, knock down the barriers to being able to make that decision. There's classic apologetics. Tends to be philosophy, like listening to William Lane Craig. He will talk about Aquinas, he will talk about Plato and Aristotle, and he will develop these philosophical concepts, the nature of God, something called divine aseity, the self-existence of God. The philosophical approach is classic apologetics. There's something called cumulative case that tries to blend everything together and say these are approaches, and the goal is to make them all work together toward a consistent conclusion, again, to hopefully advance the gospel. There's something called Reformed epistemology, a little bit tricky word. Reformed epistemology says that the fallen human mind can't really grasp all these things. That's an approach taken by a gentleman named Alvin Plantinga, who's, as a philosopher, has developed some challenges to naturalism and says if evolution is true, then our minds aren't developed enough. Our minds are corrupted. And we can't judge the evidence to say that naturalism is really the case. Because evolution, if you're going to support evolution, you can't say that we're at the peak so that we can understand these things. And then there's a fifth one called presuppositionalism. And this is a system that I hold to. It's concerned about the axioms, the first principles. For instance, in a debate, one presuppositional apologist has this wonderful method of challenging his opponents, say on an ethical question, why is murder wrong? And he would force them to not borrow from Christianity in making a moral choice, but saying from your system, not from Christianity, don't hijack ours to support yours. From the axioms, from your first principles, what is the answer to this question? And it usually confounds people because, especially in the world of ethics, people like to borrow from other systems. And Christianity is an easy one to borrow from because our Western culture is built on it. These are frameworks for doing apologetics. And in a real sense, in a practical sense, they make very little difference. There are, I'll say, fringe discussions in each group that seem to go a little too far, expecting a little too much from knowledge and the ability to make a decision, or expecting a little too much from personal faith and ignoring knowledge. There's, a few little errors that creep into proponents of each group, but by and large, the disagreements among the proponents of each are just having an intramural discussion. What makes a difference in good versus bad apologetics isn't the approach you take. That might mean better or worse, but not good or bad. I want to suggest that good apologetics, doing your best apologetics, has the same requirements that the New Testament sets for church elders. If you remember the requirements, the first one, or early in the list, is the ability to teach. That's the only one that requires knowledge. Everything else is relational. Having a good reputation, not being a fighting person, having the respect of others, having a strong family life, children who aren't out of control and such. The principles here dovetail nicely with those because we are talking about Christian maturity here. So in terms of doing good apologetics, when you're engaging people with the gospel and they have a hard question, you want to answer the question, you may sometimes say, I don't know. Or you may run into a time when you make a mistake and you get into a discussion that's over your head. Well, I think this, and I'm going to hold to this, but then they come back with some harder questions. A few years ago, I made I'll call it an unthoughtful decision. I had read a little bit on evolutionary theory and scientific questions and thought too much of myself and went on to a forum and engaged some people on the subject. And it took about 5 minutes to get put in my place. because I had not read enough material. I was not prepared. I didn't understand the subject deeply enough. And you get a couple of grad students in there who have read extensively, and it doesn't take long to learn that you shouldn't bite off more than you can chew. So, when you go into a discussion, be prepared, but know your audience too. Say you're talking to grade school kids, and you want to talk about creation. You can use great object lessons. Just pick up a ball and say everything that is had to have a creator. And that works well with children. They understand that basic concept. You get to college students, and they're going to be a little more challenging. But at that point, you can raise another question and say, well, your materialism that you're holding to doesn't answer the question on the existence of the human mind and will and consciousness. And depending upon who you're talking to, that can be a useful point in the discussion. But there's some interesting responses that can come from that one, and the discussions can get hairy. Their response is usually you're engaging in something called mind-body dualism. You're treating the mind as though it exists separate from the person. For some, that's a fair accusation. For the Christian, we would say the mind is part of the person, but it is not a material entity. It's like software, but it's not just molecules, and it's not just interactions. There's more going on there. So the apologetics you engage in, tailor to your audience. And if someone asks you a hard question, be willing to say, I don't know. I was listening to a Christian radio show the other day, and I respect the man who does the radio show, but in this instance, he did not behave well. He has a number of skeptics listening to the show, and once in a while they'll call in. Well, this one skeptic calls in and says, I see an inconsistency in how you're handling this New Testament question. So the host of the radio show says, basically, you're a skeptic. You don't believe the New Testament. Why are you asking this question? So he demeaned the caller instead of answering the question, or at least saying, I'll have to get back to you. That's really unproductive. It's on. It's in a public situation, for a radio host to demean a caller is, I was disturbed by that. I thought, he knows better than that. He shouldn't have put down a skeptic. This skeptic he listens to a show for a reason, and he had a question. Now, it might not have been a fully informed question, but, we just don't put down people that ask questions. If people are hungry, they need food. They don't need to be told to use a different fork. They need food. And when we engage in apologetics, it's important that we not take ourselves too seriously. We know the phrase, on a mission from God, and how sarcastically that is used. But if you've ever seen someone in church who's a little too excited and doesn't worry about offending other people, It's when you get into a subject matter that excites you, it's really, really easy to fall into that temptation, to get carried away on the thing that you've fallen in love with, the subject matter, and all of a sudden, that's all that matters. But that's not the same as just self-confidence. That's not the same as being ready. In fact, that sets up the question that we have to keep in mind, that the gospel may offend, but it shouldn't be us who offends. We see so much today about wanting to eliminate the cross from public sight. The cross offends. But if we offend by inserting ourselves where we don't belong and hurting people when there is no cause to hurt them, that's completely unproductive. The other person is not our opponent. The other person is our friend, not our target. In fact, when we engage in a discussion where there may even be heated disagreement, we should be able, at the end of the discussion, to say, okay, now let's go out for coffee. Or at least have that tone where we can maintain that friendship. If a discussion destroys a friendship, have we done the gospel a disservice? There's a good chance we have. And sometimes we are more the enemy of the gospel than the person asking a question or challenging us. Because let's face it, people don't ask questions unless they're seeking something. Either they're seeking the truth or they're seeking to justify their own position. And an honest, clear answer that may disagree with their personal goal of defending themselves can be a persuader. Not everyone is seeking Christ, but sometimes it's the strongest skeptics who are actually willing to respond to an answer because they're the ones dealing with the issue. Third thing is, let's be careful about condescending to people. Sometimes we think we've got the answer, and we live in our little theological echo chambers in church, and we listen to Christian radio and read our books, and we think we've got the answer. But sometimes all that material doesn't really answer the questions that people are asking. And what seems logical to us, to the person asking the question, may not make any sense because we're not dealing with the issue. That's a big problem in the creation question right now. But go back 500 years, 400 years, it was a big question in heliocentrism because of certain plain language statements in the Old Testament. There was serious theological discussion about whether the earth is the center of everything or whether the earth and the sun float in space freely. The theological discussions then were just as serious as the creation questions now. And the questions were resolved then because the church figured out that it was hanging on to Aristotle's cosmology rather than properly interpreting the Bible. And the secularists today use that as a way to beat down Christians for not knowing what they're talking about. And sometimes we don't. Sometimes our hermeneutics can be wrong. Scripture can be right, but our understanding can be messed up. It happened 400 or 500 years ago with whether or not the Earth is the center of the universe. And I expect some creation models are going to be changing too. One big change to note is that some of the young earthers are accepting, within young earth, are accepting evolution as a process, not as common origins, but even Ken Ham has evolution within each kind. His model is changing. I don't think 30 years ago he'd have said that. I don't think he had developed the model yet. So the creation models are changing. Not 100%. There's some theistic evolutionists that are throwing every baby out with the bathwater, but Christians are thinking through and adapting. There's hard questions, and if we tout the young earth creationism of the past, we might miss the hard questions that the evolutionist is asking. And some of them are good questions. Is the earth more than 6,000 years old? I think so, but that doesn't dismiss creation. There's a lot more work to be done, and the questions aren't always easy. And when we approach people, something that really examples condescending is gotcha questions. We come up with this question that seems to be one that they can't answer. And it works well in our minds. And when you talk to someone, it's gotcha, until you meet someone who's got an answer for that question. And then all of a sudden, you feel like a bit of an idiot. Why did I say that? Now they've asked me a question I can't answer. It's important to be, you don't have to be a scholar to answer all the questions. You just have to say, I don't know sometimes, and can we talk about it later? Because not all the questions we ask our opponents are easy, and not all the questions they ask us are easy. Another thing that gets in the way is partisanship. You won't go to Green Bay wearing a Bears cap and expect a good audience, okay? Oh, I live in Columbus, Ohio, and I wouldn't anyway, but I wouldn't wear a Michigan cap and go onto Ohio State's campus. There are certain things you don't do. Sports is just as partisan as politics, because every town has its culture. And partisanship can get in the way of conversation. Now, most people don't take it too seriously. Columbus is an exception, the cult of the Buckeyes over there. But I've known enough people who are in love with their sports teams all over the country, and I usually have a Wisconsin W on my fedora, but I took it off because this isn't the place for it. I'll wear it around Ohio, but has no place in the church, no place in church life. And as a Christian, what this boils down to is listening. Because if the person asking us questions has a question, there's a reason they've got a question. They want to understand something. Very, very few are asking questions in order to try and put us in our place. They want to understand something. They might want to try and figure us out. I've got a friend who's a strong progressive in his mind. And everything progressive he reads makes him think all conservatives are racists. And he thinks of me as an anomaly because I'm a little more sensible than what he reads about. Yeah, maybe someday he'll get out of his progressive echo chamber and see that he's been fed a bill of goods, and it's not like the world's not like what he's been told. And with listening is asking questions. Sometimes the motivation for a question may be totally different than the question itself. You know, that's relationships. If someone comes to you with a hard question, maybe because they had some people ask questions because there's some pain in their lives. Some people ask questions because they're curious. There's always a reason behind a question. It's not always a jumping off point for an immediate gospel presentation, but it's always a starting point for a relationship. And if we build those relationships, then we've got the opportunity to sit down with people and converse with people and let them ask questions. And then we go do our homework. And not every apologetics issue requires that you go to seminary or college or some conference and read 6 books. Some of them are very simple questions. You know, questions of public ethics today are big. Why should the government allow or disallow a certain action? Those are not really hard questions. They may take a little reading, but they do build for make for good conversation. You know, the question of abortion, I think, is going to get even bigger in the next couple of years. The president just appointed a strong pro-life lady to a government position. That's going to make some changes in public policy. And she's going to be making some changes in personnel in government agencies. That's going to be significant. But the question of rights or what are perceived as rights, and the question of what does it mean to be alive? What does it mean to be free? No one talks about, the term freedom isn't much of a topic of conversation anymore. It used to be in the 60s when our parents were reminiscing of World War II and the victory over totalitarianism, that freedom was part of the conversation. No one talks about freedom anymore. Our culture has lost the challenge. And at the same time, we're slowly drifting into our own version of totalitarianism, where we have limits on free speech coming. Discussing freedom might be a really great piece of conversation to start with people. What does it mean to be free? Where do rights come from? Is one that Christians like to use, but where do, not just rights, but what is freedom? And what is the role of government? And do you really think it's good for the government to tell you what to think? There's lots of questions, and again, going back to where we started, good apologetics will all boil down to relationships. And the academic questions, the hard questions that people ask, that's a lot of times almost secondary to the issue, because the issue is not just answering their questions, but answering them as people. Again, they're our friends, not our targets. They're our neighbors. They're our co-workers. They're human beings. And one of the last things we need to do is to be thought of as people on a mission, sort of like a hunter with a bow aiming at the next target, trying to suck them into a church, rather than being human and being Christian with them. That's how apologetics works in advancing the kingdom. It's what goes on in college and seminary classes is merely preparation for a certain aspect of apologetics. But unfortunately, apologetics is, to many people, the philosophy and the advanced studies. When you listen to the apologetics rock stars who are experts and have their radio shows and their big conferences, they're doing good work, but they're targeting a different audience. We target another audience, our co-workers and our friends and our neighbors. For us, it's different. We're not rock stars giving seminars. We're hourly workers who are going back to our jobs Monday morning and who have neighbors that are out mowing the lawn same time we are. And the goal is the advancement of the kingdom, not the advancement of knowledge. Okay, questions?
When you were talking about your friend, I'm thinking nowadays a really hard wall that we're up against is people who have this judgment already about us because they're taught this and they have their talking points and they already think we're xenophobes, homophobes, all these phobes.
Oh, yeah.
And it's hard to break through that presupposition of what we're like. And that's where maybe a relationship comes in when they get to know you a little bit and realize, no, I'm not all those things. I'm not in that basket of deplorables.
Yeah.
Like this, just so broadly spoken about, and it's hard to break through that.
And that takes time. It's tough to communicate to people. No, I'm not doing this out of hate. I'm doing this out of morality. And there's more to it than the simple question that seems to be on the surface. It's tough to break through that wall. And sometimes, given that people live in their little echo chambers, it's impossible to get them out of that echo chamber. And sometimes in the church, we live in our echo chamber, where we hear the same things in our sermons and Sunday school classes week after week, month after month, year after year, and we don't know what's going on in the world outside of us. When I made my mistake of jumping onto an evolution forum and asking uninformed questions, that situation challenged me to not read my side's material, but to read their side's material. So this past 10 years, I've been reading everything on their side, not on our side. And now I have good discussions with people, and they're not defensive for the most part. They wonder how a Christian can understand these things. Because don't you believe in creation and Adam and Eve? They don't understand some. When I engage college, even graduate students, they're living in their own echo chamber. And I've had fun asking them hard questions that their profs probably haven't even considered. So the hard questions go everywhere. And it's hard to recognize our own echo chamber, let alone challenge someone else's.
And I think our absolute truth has gone out the window too. It's like,
Oh, yeah.
What is your own truth? And then when you try to follow them with their truth, they'll come up against, well, wait a minute, they can't be consistent with their truth. Sometimes you can lead them down that way. You can, like you were saying, where they're coming from, get into their world and ask questions about, hey, to get them to think about why they believe the way they believe. And you can get into the whole thing about, so this is your truth, not, to get them to say this is their own truth, not the truth, and realize that, that's really difficult to get. There is absolute truth, and Christ is the truth, and it's hard to get to that.
But to put it in their language is harder. I've ended up retreating to a simple mathematical question. Does 1 + 1 equal 2? Yes. Then there is such a thing as some absolute truth. And from there, depending upon where the conversation goes, they have trouble denying absolute truth if there is mathematical truth. They have to accept something. Now, some of the people have, since I've engaged college students online, they'll go into evolutionary morality and such, and they're getting that from the new atheists. Interesting crowd, but it's entirely speculative at that point. It's all guesswork. And the question of morality is a great conversation to have with people, because they want to redefine marriage, but they want secure relationships at the same time. They miss the disconnect. We live, to get a little bit philosophical, we live in a world run by Plato. And back in the late 1700s, there was this guy named Immanuel Kant, who's, on the one hand, accepted absolute values, but on the other hand, said that knowledge was based on our perceptions of truth. He was, Neo-Platonist. And everything today we're facing has cascaded off of Kant's proposals. So we separate ideas from the physical world. We separate the pleasures of physical intimacy from the biology of childbearing. We separate physical biology from perception of gender. We've separated the physical world from the perceptions of the mind. And that seems to be the norm today.
And when it comes down to it, the fact about something being absolutely true, someone told me once that they didn't like that because it offends people, it steps on toes. What are you telling me, that what I'm doing is not right because this is not true? They don't want to be, and when you dig deeper, it's, I don't want to be accountable to God.
Right. Or anyone else, not just God, but, and they're creating, I think there's some politics at play in this too. We're building a spirit of anarchy in the country now, where everyone wants to be free of everyone else. You try driving down the interstate and find one person obeying the speed limit. It's like driving through 9094 when the speed limit signs still say 55 miles an hour. And if you're going under 70, you're going to get run over. the law is merely there now.
A suggestion.
Yeah. That's
Like the laws they don't want to, the immigration laws that we already have in place that they don't want to follow. We want to have sanctuary cities. We want to take people in who are actually being illegal. And it's like, let's skirt the law because we don't feel that it's right.
Yeah. Well, and there's another one of those dualisms. They want the virtue of compassion without the duty of law. And Christ challenged the Pharisees on that. They wanted duty, but wanted to avoid virtue in helping the poor. And when he challenged them, he didn't say, quit your little spice offerings and then go help the poor. He said, you should have done that while not forgetting the former. So he emphasized maintaining duty, but adding virtue to it. I think Peter did emphasize that in some different languages in his letters. We live in a world that tries to separate virtue from duty. And unfortunately, it seems like in some situations, our police are told to enforce law, duty, but don't often add virtue to it. Many do, but those who don't are the ones that make the news, and that's unfortunate. But then they're not a virtue organization, they're a duty organization anyway, so may not be a fully fair assessment, but duty without virtue is destructive. Virtue without duty is anarchy. Or should I say, duty without virtue is totalitarian. And virtue without duty is anarchy. And when we have shared sense of duty and virtue in a society, then we're a cohesive society. Whether it's Christian or even a liberal society, whatever those senses of duty and virtue are. America hasn't been a Christian consensus really since World War I. Yet we've been generally at peace here in a progressive society. And Christians can survive and thrive in any world. The church in China is a great example, growing by about 10,000 people a day. Wow. Under persecution. And we complain when we don't get our rights. We call a lawyer. They plant churches.
And just look at Daniel.
Yeah.
How he thrived in the situation he was in. He stayed true and was able to do it even though he had things against him.
One of my college profs went to, after undergrad, he went to teach in a seminary up in Canada. And he was teaching this church growth class. And he had this student in his class from Burma. And the student from Burma took the class because he wanted to make sure they were doing their church growth the right way. And so Chuck asked him, well, how do you do it? He says, well, for 3 months, the elders will get up early in the morning and pray together, asking the Lord to give volunteers to send out to plant churches. Then they'll put a call out to young people who are willing to do that, and then they, for 3 months, will get up early every day and pray with those young people and work with them and prepare them to go out. Then they would send them across the border into communist China to plant churches. And he asked them, how many churches did they plant? Oh, about 200. And then he says, are we doing it right? It's like, we're concerned about having big buildings here. They're concerned about actually touching people. And a church will grow when there's suffering. It stagnates when there's prosperity. And the more prosperous America becomes, the more stagnant the church will become. We love our prosperity. You know, it's, I love you, Lord, but let me upgrade my iPhone. That sounds a little cynical, but we in the church are more progressively materialist than we want to acknowledge. It's one of the hard questions that we've not faced. It's a tough one. What am I willing to sacrifice? Now, do I really need another car? Do I really need another iPhone? Do I really need X, Y, or Z? You know, can I wear these jeans another couple weeks? You know, no one wants to look grubby, but I don't know. After what Nordstrom's came out with, maybe we could fit in at church better than we thought.
The muddy jeans?
Yeah, $400.
They cost like $400 for a pair of jeans that look muddy, like you work, you want to.
Yeah, city people want to look like they work for a living.
Or I've seen ones that you can buy with the holes in them already. That's when
they've been doing that for 15 years.
When our kids were little, and I'm like, if you want that kind of pair of jeans, then you'll have to pay for it. I'm not buying jeans that are already worn out.
Yeah, you can buy good jeans cheaper and tear them yourself.
Yeah, I can do that myself.
Yeah. Well, thank you for coming. A small, cozy group.
The best kind.